Hi, welcome to On the Edge. I'm your host, Matthew Wexler, and you are watching Edge Media Network, your go-to source for LGBTQ news and entertainment. Recognized as one of our generation's most formidable human rights activists, today's guest has been at the forefront of LGBTQ issues for more than half a century. He has been arrested, assaulted, denounced by his opposers, and yet he continues to fight for queer rights. Peter Tatchell has been called everything from a performance artist to the most hated man in Britain. And now a new documentary, Hating Peter Tatchell, chronicles his life and work. The film is now streaming on Netflix in the US and will have a theatrical world premiere at the Melbourne International Film Festival on August 11th. Let's take a look.
Punched and kicked by anti-gay protesters in Moscow today.
Someone protect me, someone protect me!
Before being arrested by police.
Being targeted for violent attack comes with the territory.
Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Tatchell.
Stop homophobia in the Commonwealth!
Peter Tatchell has devoted his life to crusading for homosexuals.
When people in power won't show compassion, sometimes you have to up the ante.
He writes the book on how to do a protest.
Peter is a performance artist.
I am trying to ensure the arrest of a torturer.
He deserves recognition for his extraordinary contribution to the happiness of millions who've never heard of him.
The whole gay community owes you because of your bravery and your courage.
Gay activist Peter Tatchell refused to move on.
Please. No, we are not moving away.
Does Peter have an ego? Yes, you need an ego to perform.
Can you shut up now,
I'm
please?
not going to shut up. This is not a free and open debate.
This is the most disliked man in Britain.
From the early days, I thought Peter was a brave motherfucker.
Let me be frank, I don't think Peter was always helping.
If you let me finish, let me finish.
The church for 2,000 years have been saying we're sick and sinful and immoral and we're going to burn in hell.
The Archbishop of Canterbury was interrupted today by a gay rights protest.
Dr. Carey opposes lesbian and gay human rights.
He's a bullying kind of chap trying to get his own way.
Real men don't get insecure about gay men. Real men can cope with it. Scared by a few gay men. Hey, Peter Tatchell, I'll see you again, you pussy!
What keeps me going is the knowledge that the homophobes who are against me want me to give up. Just like the suffragettes, or the black civil rights movement in America, we have to get a bit angry and confrontational. We've tried to play by the rules, it hasn't worked, now we're going to break the rules.
I watched the film, and I promise you that your heart will be racing during this real-life thriller. Tatchell takes on some of the world's most staunch opposers of LGBTQ and human rights. I am so excited for this conversation to find out what makes Tatchell tick. Let's bring him on, Peter Tatchell.
Great.
Peter, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. Evening, your time, late morning, our time. We are spanning the pond, as they say, to have you join us. It's a pleasure to have you.
My pleasure to join you.
Thank you. I want to dive right in. You know, this film documents more than 50 years of your work and life as an international human rights activist. And there's really some heavy hitters behind it. Executive producers Elton John and his husband, David Furnish. How did the whole concept of the movie come about?
Well, it originated with the director, Christopher Amos. He was astonished to discover that there'd never been a film made about my many years of human rights work. And he thought it was a story worth telling. And when he began to do research, he was astonished to discover the level of vitriol and hate that was directed against me by homophobes, far-right extremists, and others. So that's how the title Hating Peter Tatchell came about.
You really see that reflected throughout the film. The movie is also framed and beautifully directed and edited with commentary by Stephen Fry, the actor, and our beloved Ian McKellen, which there we have the two of you together. It's such a great shot, sort of this intimate conversation. Did you have any concerns about the way your life might be portrayed?
Well, I thought that it's up to the director to do what he wanted to do. And, you know, I gave the director full creative license. And apart from the collaboration when I went to Moscow, I did not interfere or get involved in the film in any way. It's Christopher Amos's personal story about my life.
Yeah, you really get that sense. There is sort of a lens of objectivity. Did you know Ian McKellen before, or was there some sort of connection with your advocacy work or your nonprofit organization prior to the film being made?
Oh yeah, I've known Ian McKellen for many, many years, and he's been a great supporter of the work that I do.
So scrolling back a little bit, you were born in Melbourne, Australia, and you took to activism at a very young age, even in school. I'm curious when, if you can recall your perspective sort of shifting from issues sort of in your immediate environment to a wider, more global lens. Was there something that happened, one aha moment, or was sort of an accumulation of just a greater awareness as you were getting older?
Well, it all began when I was 11 years old in 1963. I heard about the bombing of a black church in Birmingham, Alabama, where 4 young girls about my own age were murdered by white racists. I was only 11, but I knew that was so wrong. And that motivated me to follow the Black Civil Rights Movement in America. You know, it had nothing to do with me personally, but I could see that this was a just cause. And indeed, the Black Civil Rights Movement in America has been much of the template for my subsequent activism. The values, the ideals, the methods of nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience used by Dr. Martin Luther King and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, those are the kinds of methods that I've embraced and adapted to my own contemporary struggle for LGBT plus and indeed other human rights as well.
Right. At what point, I guess, did you sort of recognize or sort of start to consider your own sexual orientation and sort of shifting that perspective from a cause that you supported that was perhaps maybe outside of your purview into something that was more immediate and personal?
Well, I realized I was gay in 1969 at the age of 17. I came out in the early part of that year, and I never heard about the Stonewall uprising, but I did hear about a subsequent march through New York by the early gay liberation movement. And that inspired me. In my hometown of Melbourne, Australia, there were no LGBT plus organizations, no helplines, no counseling services, no switchboards, absolutely nothing. But as soon as I heard about this march, I thought to myself, yes, I want to be part of this movement. I want to do something. I can remember trying to persuade the few gay friends I had to set up an organization, but they were all too afraid because back then, male homosexuality was punishable in the state of Victoria, which is where Melbourne is located, by several years imprisonment and even by enforced psychiatric treatment. So I couldn't get anyone interested. They all said to me, you're an idiot, you're a danger, you're a threat to us, go away, you'll get us all arrested. So all I could do was write letters to newspapers challenging homophobic reporting or making the case for the decriminalization of homosexuality. That was the limit of my activism in those early days.
Right. Yeah, you know, it's incredible and I guess in some ways disheartening, and yes, some forward momentum is happening in terms of you sort of acknowledge the forced psychiatric treatment or quote unquote conversion therapy, which we're having a reckoning in this country with as well, and we're seeing that sort of ripple throughout the country. That is still something that exists across the world.
Oh, absolutely. There are so many countries around the world who practice various forms of psychiatric treatment, whether that be things like drug-inducing nausea or electric shocks or what they call re-education centers like they have in Qatar. And of course, in Western countries, there are many, mostly religious organizations, which seek to convert LGBT plus people to change their orientation, their identity, even though it's been shown that those practices do not work, as well as being unethical and harmful.
Yes, yes. You know, through your years of work, you have maintained a relationship with your mother, despite suffering abuse from your stepfather. There you are with your mom, Marty, growing up in a very conservative household, evangelical Christian. I'm curious how you have been able to reconcile your convictions, your passion, your beliefs, and preserve that relationship, because it's very touching as it's sort of highlighted throughout the film.
Well, it's been very difficult because both my parents were very devout evangelical Pentecostal Christians, borderline fundamentalists. So it's been a process of negotiation and dialogue, and it's been tough at times. But I think it's very encouraging that although my mother still believes that technically homosexuality is wrong because it says so in the Bible, she is now at a place where she also very strongly believes that the persecution of LGBT plus people is very, very wrong. So she has supported my campaigns, including campaigns to challenge homophobia in the church. And she's always been very welcoming, accepting of my partner. So there's still a work in progress, but I think compared to where she and my father and stepfather came from, they have made huge, huge strides. And I think it's a great example of, you know, the need to dialogue and to make the case and to challenge even people in our own family, but also with love and affection. And the bid and the aim is, of course, always to win them over.
Yes, it's an interesting juxtaposition, that sort of attitude you have towards the familial relationship versus nonviolent but somewhat confrontational methods that you've used in your work, you know, throughout the past 50 years. So you moved to London. I would love to just...
Can I just finish on that point?
Yeah, absolutely.
I have the same approach when it comes to hardline homophobes, biphobes, and transphobes. You know, obviously I will challenge them, but I'll always hold out the olive branch, the hope that they may redeem themselves. And indeed, you know, the former defense minister of the UK, Michael Patillo, voted time and time again against LGBT plus equality legislation. I challenged him remorselessly and eventually persuaded him to change his mind. And when he did, I wrote to him a letter of thanks. And he has been a great ally since. The same as you will see in the film, the Archbishop of Canterbury has gone through a process of change because I persisted with dialogue as well as challenge.
Right. It's a delicate balance and requires, I think, time, patience, resilience. So London, you left Melbourne and arrived in a frolicking London. And what year and what was that energy and experience like when you first arrived in London?
Well, I was 19. It was 1971. Male homosexuality had been partly decriminalized in England and Wales in 1967, but still most aspects of gay male life were criminal. And police repression and harassment was very, very intense. But the Gay Liberation Front had been formed shortly before I arrived. So I think 5 days after I got into London, I was at my first meeting. And within a month, I was helping to organize many of the Gay Liberation Front's spectacular street protests.
And then with the onset of the AIDS crisis and this sort of massive change to the gay community, this year marks the 40th anniversary of the first reported cases of what then was not even known as AIDS. It would eventually be titled as such. On our side of the pond, we had activists like Larry Kramer, Michael Kalin, and others emerge. What was the experience living through that in the UK? And then what did you think, of course, of then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's response, or lack thereof?
Of course, for the first few years, the UK government did nothing. So long as gay and bisexual men were dying, the government's response was indifference. It was only when the first heterosexual people died of AIDS that the government suddenly set up sat up and began doing things. But even then, the response was very weak. The main HIV support organization, the Terence Higgins Trust, received derisory government grants in the first few years of about $60,000, $70,000. Pathetic. We felt really, really angry. So in 1987, I set up the UK AIDS Vigil Organization, which was an organization specifically set up to campaign for the human rights of people living with HIV. And I drafted, I think, what was the world's first AIDS and Human Rights Charter. And then later that year, we heard that the World Health Ministers were having a summit on AIDS in London in January 1988. So we organized a huge candlelit march to the conference center on the eve of the opening day, and followed it up with a parallel AIDS and Human Rights conference, literally at the same time as the main World Health Ministers Conference, and in the building next door. And we succeeded in persuading those ministers to issue a declaration against discrimination to protect people with HIV, a very important milestone.
Yes, yes. And at that same time, it was also 1988, Thatcher introduced Section 28, which is something I think many Americans are probably not familiar with. It was Section 28 of the Local Government Act. What did that legislation imply, and what did you do to oppose it?
Section 28 was the first new anti-gay law in Britain for a century, and it explicitly prohibited local authorities, that means local councils and municipalities, local education authorities, local health authorities, etc., from doing anything that could be construed as favoring, supporting, encouraging, or promoting homosexuality, or the idea that LGBT people in love constituted families. So it was a very draconian law. It meant that out of fear of prosecution, libraries pulled gay-themed books from their shelves, cinemas and local municipal arts facilities scrapped gay plays, and of course schools suddenly refused to give any kind of support or affirmation to LGBT plus kids, and homophobic bullying went more or less unchecked in our schools for 15 years until that law was finally repealed in 2003.
Shortly after that, you were part of another emerging LGBTQ activist group called OutRage. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, around the same time, another organization emerged, Stonewall. From what I understand from watching the film, perhaps the end game was similar, but the agendas in getting there were somewhat different. Could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit, what those differences were and how you were able to find common ground to work toward the same causes?
Well, like the London Gay Liberation Front, OutRage was modeled on the Black Civil Rights Movement in America and the suffrage campaign for votes for women here in Britain. We used non-violent direct action and civil disobedience to challenge people in power. We had to challenge them because for decades, people in power would not listen, would not consult, would not reform the laws that persecuted LGBT plus people. The police wouldn't meet us, the church wouldn't meet us, the government wouldn't meet us, the parliament, the legislature wouldn't even discuss LGBT plus issues. So we had to use those provocative confrontational tactics, and I might say so very successfully, to put LGBT plus issues in the news. Now, our strategy was, by doing these very colorful, exciting, daring, imaginative, and often very funny protests, we got masses of media coverage. And through that media coverage, we raised public awareness about the scale of persecution that LGBT plus people faced. And off the back of that, there were radio phone-in programs, TV chat discussions, and of course, public meetings and so on. So it helped contribute to a raising of public awareness. At the same time, put the authorities under pressure because, when we reported that 2 lesbians had been arrested for merely holding hands, and we got that in the press. The journalist went to the police chief and said, on what basis are these lesbians being arrested? Is this an appropriate use of police resources? So it was a very effective campaign. Now, Stonewall was primarily a parliamentary lobbying group. It was lobbying government, but of course it wasn't getting anywhere because the doors were slammed, and that's why outrage was necessary. We did our direct action, which created the fury, and of course Stonewall then went to the government or the police or the church and said, you don't want to deal with those nasty outrage people, but we're very nice, we're very polite, come and talk to us. So outrage helped open the doors to Stonewall. But another thing I'd say is that outrage did have different objectives. Of course, we wanted equal rights, but we understood that equal rights was not sufficient. Stonewall was wedded to just mere equality. Outrage was committed to LGBT plus liberation. And the difference is that we said, we don't want to be equal in a fundamentally flawed, unjust society. We want to change society to make it better for everyone. LGBTs first and foremost, but also for straight people as well, and for Black and ethnic minority people, for women, for people with disabilities, for other persecuted communities. So we had a much more intersectional and I suppose inclusive approach. And I'll just give you one example. Sure. So with regard to sex education in schools, we said, of course, there needs to be equality in sex education, but straight kids get very poor quality sex education. So our argument was, let's improve sex and relationship education for all kids, whatever their sexuality and whatever their gender identity. Whereas Stonewall was just saying, give us the same as straight people has got. And we just said, that's not good enough. Straight people have got a poor deal when it comes to sex and relationship education in schools. Let's make it better for everyone.
Right. One of the kinds of actions taken got a lot of scrutiny, I think, from all sides, for better or for worse, and that had to do with outing of certain political and religious figures, a tactic that some consider might have done more harm than good. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. And throughout all of your years of activism, you've lived such a full life. Do you have any regrets of any actions taken, or are there moments or campaigns that, looking in retrospect, you would have pivoted and perhaps approached in a different manner?
Well, my biggest regret is not using outing earlier and more frequently. We did not out anyone because they were in the closet. We targeted homophobes, people who preached against homosexuality while being gay themselves. So we were exposing their homophobia and their hypocrisy. And it was very, very, very effective. With regard to bishops in the Church of England, after they were named, none of them again colluded with the homophobia of the church. It prompted the Archbishop of Canterbury to set up the first ever dialogue with the LGBT plus community. And it prompted the House of Bishops as a collectivity to issue a very strong declaration against homophobic discrimination. Now, none of those three things would have happened if we hadn't created a crisis, a catalytic moment of naming those bishops. And when it came to the members of parliament, we never actually outed any of them. We did write to them and urge them to come out, saying it was the morally right thing to do. And we called them out over voting against gay equality while being gay themselves. But we never actually outed them. Between us, it's only people in outrage to this day know who we wrote to, which MPs. I can tell you this, nearly all those MPs eventually stopped voting for equality and became allies. So again, I think outing did, that even wasn't a threat of outing. That was just a private appeal to them by private letter. That had a great positive effect as well.
Right. Of the many protests that you've organized and participated in throughout your life, your trip to Moscow for the FIFA 2018 World Cup really made international headlines and was profound in so many ways. We have a clip of that part of your experience, and I would love to take a look and share with our viewers.
holding up a placard highlighting the plight of gay men in Chechnya.
Peter Tatchell didn't feel that he was breaking the law.
Who was detained has been released today.
He joins us now.
Under President Putin, there has been a long...
My protest was about the criminalization of LGBT equality.
Just as I hoped, it stole Putin's thunder. I want the story not to be just about Russia hosting the World Cup. It's put LGBT rights in the headlines around the world.
That was fantastic, Peter. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Tower 5. Take care of yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Thanks, hon. Bye-bye.
I mean, that clip is harrowing in so many ways. You really walked into the eye of the storm. You know, we see this on the ground confrontation in the film. I'm curious what sort of allies you may have found as well beyond your core group that you were traveling with when you got there.
Well, I basically went alone, just with the film's director, Christopher Amos. So I was all by myself. I deliberately did not inform Russian LGBT plus activists. I've worked with them for many years, but I knew that I didn't want to put them in the frame where they could potentially be charged and prosecuted for aiding and abetting what I did. So it was a very deliberate attempt. Afterwards, of course, you know, they made it very clear that that's exactly what they wanted to happen. They wanted the headlines on the opening day of the World Cup to all be about the persecution of LGBT plus people in Russia, and particularly in Chechnya. So it was a very, very scary experience because I didn't know what was going to happen. I mean, previously I'd been to Russia 4 times previously and been very badly beaten up by neo-Nazis with the collusion of the Moscow police. And I was afraid of a repeat of that. You know, I've got brain and eye damage from that beating. I was also, you know, worried that, you know, I could be charged with some serious offense and end up spending, you know, some weeks or more in a Russian prison.
And you were detained. You were arrested, correct?
That's right. No, I did spend some hours in a Russian police cell, but you know, for me, what overrode my fears was the importance of showing solidarity with the incredibly brave, heroic Russian activists who live there 24/7. 365 days a year. They are taking risks with their lives and liberty all the time. So I thought I could take a few risks for one day.
And you did. And you did. Here in the US, there has been this wave of violence against transgender and gender non-conforming people. The Human Rights Campaign tracked 44 fatalities last year and already 30 in 2021. We're only in July. Are you tracking similar patterns internationally? And I'm curious what your foundation's efforts are in taking action particular to transgender rights and awareness.
Well, we work very closely with transgender organizations here in the UK and with some international ones as well. And certainly our main role is to amplify their voices. So Trans Pride was held in London 2 or 3 weeks ago. We were there, we helped publicize and promote it. We helped give voices to trans people to speak for themselves. In the past, I've done work, you know, in faraway places like Honduras, where many trans people have been victimized. We did a project with groups in Honduras 3 years ago to highlight the scale of persecution of LGBT, but particularly the trans people there in that country.
You mentioned Trans Pride in London. I noticed when I was doing some research on your site that the foundation, the Peter Tatchell Foundation, is one of the sponsors of the first ever Reclaim Pride March in London, which is going to be on July 24th. Could you talk a little bit about what that signifies?
Well, there's a huge rebellion in Britain against the way in which the big city prides have gone. They've become very commercialized, very corporate, and totally depoliticized. And you know, we still have a global fight. You know, never mind the battles we still have to fight in countries like Britain and America. You know, we have a global fight for LGBT plus liberation worldwide. And so Reclaim Pride is about really reclaiming pride for the community, putting community groups center stage, and giving a platform to our ongoing human rights demands, which include things like banning conversion therapy, giving safe haven to LGBT plus people fleeing persecution abroad, trans rights, the reform of the Gender Recognition Act here in UK, decriminalization of homosexuality worldwide, and solidarity with Black Lives Matter. It's a very, very different approach from Pride in London and other big pride parades around the UK. And we've had a huge outpouring of support, and I'm very confident that this Saturday we'll have a great turnout. We're doing it on a shoestring with only a handful of volunteers, but you know, it will be something big and significant, and very much molded on the LGBT plus liberation march in New York, which took place a few weeks ago. The same kind of ethos. We want to get back to the roots of pride. You know, pride is a celebration, but it's also a protest.
Well, if anyone can put it front and center, I think it would be you. What advice would you give to our viewers who want to get involved, but perhaps don't have the constitution to put themselves on the front lines like you have throughout your life?
Well, I think it's really important to join and or financially support an LGBT plus organization. There are loads and loads of them, very worthy causes. Do that. That's a very simple thing. For those who are interested in finding out more about the work that I do, you can go to my foundation's website, which is petertatchellfoundation.org. In the top right-hand corner, there's a little button which says Join Us. If you give us your email address, we will send you a weekly bulletin about LGBT plus and other human rights issues. It's totally free. There's no charge, but it's a good way to keep in touch with the work we do, which has a British but also a global focus.
Yes, I would agree. I get your newsletter, your e-news, and I think particularly for American readership, and we're sometimes sort of focused on what's happening here in the US, and there's plenty to keep track of and support, but to have a different perspective and a global perspective is incredibly important, and you provide a lot of really valuable information in that way. I want to thank you, Peter, for joining us, not only for today's conversation, but really for your unrelenting dedication and your work over the past 50 years. It's been incredible for me to talk to you, and I hope that we've also brought awareness to some of the issues that you hold close to your heart.
Well, thank you. You know, I do my bit, but so do many others, and it's our collective effort that has helped us win the gains we've achieved. So hats off and hands around to everyone who's been part of this process. You know, we together have made stupendous changes. There is still work to do, but boy, we have moved mountains. And I just finished with my motto, which is very simple. Don't accept the world as it is. Dream of what the world could be, and then help make it happen.
Thank you. Help make it happen. I hope you were as blown away by that conversation as I was. What a life. Once again, you can catch Hating Peter Tatchell on Netflix. And of course, we wish our best to the production team on the film's theatrical premiere at the Melbourne International Film Festival next month. Speaking of premieres, we have a few of our own here on Edge Media Network, which I hope you'll be able to join. Next week, we have singer-songwriter Ryan Casada joining us as part of our Living Sober series in collaboration with Recovery Unplugged. We will be talking about how music has impacted his life and sobriety, along with a live performance. Next month, on August 24th, just in time for the new school year, we have Joe English, founder of Hope in a Box, which provides educators LGBTQ inclusive materials. And then on September 21st, we have the hilarious, provocative comedian, actor, musician, advocate, entrepreneur, and artist, Margaret Cho. Of course, you can always tune into edgemedianetwork.com for all the latest news, and follow us on social media to see those breaking stories first. Until next time, I'm Matthew Wexler, encouraging you to live on the edge.